Welcome to Same Old Song, the Lectionary podcast of Mockingbird Ministries, an organization that exists to connect the Christian faith with the realities of everyday life. As always and ever, I'm Scott Jones, your co-host. In just a moment, I'll be joined by Jacob Smith, the rector at Calvary St. George's Episcopal Church in New York City. He and I will be your guide every Tuesday to a grace-infused, cosmopolitan look at the lectionary passages for the week. We'll do our best to help both pastors and churchgoers alike to connect the never-changing truth of God's grace as found in these texts with what feels like an ever-changing and sometimes confusing world. And we'll do that all in 25 minutes or less. Jake, once more into the breach, my friend. Here we go, back into our lectionary groove. This is the third Sunday of Advent coming up on us in the third episode of Same Old Song. And by the way, thanks for the feedback that lots of listeners have given us. And we're thrilled that anyone is listening. And we're overwhelmed at how many of you are listening. And we got some great suggestions, which we are going to take note of. And some of them we will be incorporating this very week. You ask, we deliver. That's how it goes here on Same Old Song.
I do want to preface that we're only going to be taking a few suggestions. No, I'm just kidding. I would do whatever it takes for people to listen.
For $20, your suggestion goes right to the top, front of the line.
That's right. Absolutely. Well, here we are, and it is the third Sunday of Advent, and everybody's getting ready to think about their sermons, or maybe you just like a little devotional material to see you through the week. Scott Jones and I deliver. I'm Jacob Smith, and I'm the rector of Calvary St. George's Episcopal Church here in Manhattan, and this Sunday is Gallaudet Sunday, and it is a Sunday where the theme is all about joy, and we demonstrate that joy by lighting a pink candle. Why not?
Why the heck not? I mean, that's what I always say about candles and these sorts of things. What do the 39 articles say? That traditions of men, if they're not unbiblical, we should just do them.
Why not? Absolutely.
We should go along to get along. No Puritan, weird, if the Bible doesn't command it, we shouldn't do it. Feedback from me.
It's funny. One time, 3 years ago, I was at a church, and the Advent wreath was made out of pine needles, and it was the third Sunday of Advent, and they had these really low candles, and on the third Sunday of Advent, they lit the wreath, but the first Sunday of Advent candle, something happened, but the rest of the wreath caught fire in the middle of the sermon, and because it was dry pine needles, it was pine that made up the wreath that had dried up, it just caught like a flame, and it was a real mess.
I have a friend who pastors a Presbyterian church in Mendham, New Jersey, and they call it Hilltop Church because the sanctuary is up on a hill. That sanctuary has burned down 3 times. One of the times, it was like in the 19th century or 18th century, like early 19th, and the thing with the wheels, with the water sort of, mechanism that they would fight the fire with, it was so icy, it kept sliding down. They still do candlelight service on Christmas Eve. I would not let a candle within 100 yards of that sanctuary. Those people are literally playing with fire.
That's amazing.
Come on, baby, light my fire. Come on, baby, light my fire. Try to set the night on fire.
Well, we come to our first reading on the third Sunday of Advent from the Old Testament, which is Isaiah 35, verses 1 through 10. And this is a very powerful passage, which is very reflective of the day, reflective of the idea of joy. But it's only understood in light of Isaiah 34, where you see and hear about God's judgment and his wrath, because as we know, Judah had begun to play with fire and had begun to take on other gods. And so we hear in Isaiah 34, and in order to really, I think, especially if you're just preaching the text of Isaiah, in order to get it across well to your listeners, you have to let them in on Isaiah 34, which is just a brutal, brutal chapter where you have Well, God is described as a judge, and the fact is that we don't like to talk about God that way. We have no right not to talk about him that way. But Isaiah 34 is a very powerful, powerful passage where God is talked about as a judge, and there are words in here like their slain shall be cast out, and the stench of their corpses shall rise, and upon the people I have devoted destruction. The Lord has a sword, and it is satiated with blood. This is God basically in Isaiah 34 is described as Conan the barbarian, and and rightly so. And this moves us into a clear understanding of what Isaiah 35 is all about. If you want to preach law and gospel, you have to preach Isaiah 34, hit on that first, and then you can come into Isaiah 35.
It's really interesting. Doug Bratt over at the Center for Excellence in Preaching, which I want to recommend to everybody. It's a great resource out of Calvin Seminary. Doug Bratt, who I think is an Old Testament scholar, he says this on the given lection. He says, with the words that this text shouldn't be here, my colleague Barbara Lundblad begins a thoughtful presentation on Isaiah 35. After all, as she points out, it's not just that this text doesn't address anyone by name. It's also that it almost immediately follows a poem that's full of images of creational disaster. Edom's streams will be turned into pitch, her dust into burning sulfur, her land will become blazing pitch. Thorns will overrun her citadels, nettles and brambles her stronghold. Isaiah 34. Into that promise of environmental devastation, Isaiah says, the desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. Lundblad notes, Isaiah dares to speak a word out of place, a word that refuses to wait until things improve. Walter Brueggemann says something similar when he points out Israel's doxologies are characteristically against the data.
Oh, that's amazing. If you've ever been to the desert, and I grew up in the southwest corner of Arizona, man, it looks like Mars for the most part. But, every once in a while, like once every 7 years, you have these like heavy rains that cause the desert literally to bloom in the middle of the spring. I mean, everything turns green for a brief moment. And I can imagine like this kind of illustration making a lot of sense to those people. However, it comes as a promise because Babylon is right at the door. Babylon is coming to knock these people down. And but if you look, there's a bloom there. There's a promise of beauty in the midst of real ashes. And it says, the glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, and the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. This isn't something that they're going to produce on their own. This is something that's going to be given to them, all gift. And that is really the power of the gospel, is that it's given to us all gift. Any sort of beauty, any sort of glory comes from above.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying about God as divine judge, which again makes people uncomfortable. This is, I think we mentioned this a couple weeks ago, but this is almost, this kind of phrase that you hear in a lot of church circles today that is shorthand for the gospel, that you're more sinful than you could have than you ever thought, and yet more love than you could have imagined. And so it's not until you have the honest inventory of the fact that we're not just in a mess, but we're dead. That the good news of resurrection comes. That you don't need an out of place word if you're sort of papering over the nature of the situation. But when we realize that our condition is one, God doesn't save the world from its death, but in its death.
Yeah, that's right.
Then we need the doxological courage to talk about imaginative grace.
It's very powerful. And the idea here too, especially on a Sunday about joy, so often in our culture and our society, joy and happiness are kind of used intermittently. However, from a Christian and a biblical understanding, we teach that happiness and joy are two separate things. Happiness is based on conditions, and joy actually is something that's produced within us. It's a fruit of the gospel that comes from hearing a promise. And in this chapter, Isaiah gives the people of Israel a promise, the people of Judah a promise. It says, then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped, and the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the speechless sing for joy. For water shall break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. It's this word outside of us that actually opens our eyes to what actually God is doing. It's this word of the gospel that opens our ears to hear what God's doing on on our behalf in the gospel, and it really it's this word outside of us that causes us to get up on our feet in the midst of despair and to preach and sing for joy because there has been a declaration about us that is unchangeable, even in the midst of our surrounding circumstances. And I think that's why the prophet then goes on to talk about a highway shall be there, and it shall be called the Holy Way. This ultimately, I think as we both would agree, finds its fulfillment in the one who says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and nobody comes to the Father but through me. That is Jesus, and he is the one who makes us clean to travel on it, and he is the one who ransoms us. And someday, very soon, we, the redeemed, shall come to Zion singing, we're going to see our King.
Knock me down and back up again. You're in my blood. I'm not a lonely man. There's no load I can't hold. The road's so rough. This I know. I'll be there when the light comes in. Just tell them we're survivors. Life is a highway. I wanna ride it all night long.
And let's go on to James.
Ooh, James, everybody's favorite book. What did Luther say about James?
The Epistle of Gold.
Absolutely. I oftentimes refer to James as an epistle of law. It's kind of the Proverbs of the New Testament. And when you delve into James, hermeneutically, first of all, we need to, I think, remember, and tell me what you think about this. I think hermeneutically, we always need to remember that we read James through St. Paul, not St. Paul through James.
All right.
No?
I like it. I like it.
You like it? Good.
I like it.
Good. Well, James eventually agreed with St. Paul at the Council of Jerusalem in the book of Acts. So that's just what I've always thought.
Yeah, I also think it's just in general like good theological practice to know what your canon within a canon is.
Sure, absolutely.
Because people talk about we teach plenary inspiration, which means everything is equally inspired, which, I mean, most Orthodox Christians would assent to that, but no one practices plenary inspiration. Mm-hmm. Nobody preaches as much from Leviticus as they do from Proverbs, as they do from Romans, as they do from the Gospel of John. So
I do.
I think, well, I mean, other than you. I mean, when I say no one, of course, present company excluded. I think that there's two ways to have a canon within a canon. The way when you acknowledge it and know where your biases are, and the way where you don't. Yeah. And just kind of do it
really
anyway.
Good.
So it's important to realize what text you interpret in light of other texts. Because also, I think you'll be more generous to other Christians because you'll realize, hey, I might disagree with them, but I realize that they're trying to make sense of the whole picture of the Bible the best they can, and even if I don't agree with their judgments on it, I can be patient with them, as James calls us to be patient.
That's
how
right.
you like that? I call that full circle, y'all.
That's very good. I really think that this particular part of the Epistle of James, chapter 5, verses 7 through 10, is essentially the bumper sticker of what Advent is all about. As we wait in this season of already and not yet. Sometimes I look around and I wonder, is God coming back? And every preacher has people in their parish that, especially during this time, as we approach Christmas, and for most people, even though we're in Advent, Christmas has already begun, and they're dealing and coming to the grips with the fact that maybe,
Yeah, some people even do lessons in carols.
I know.
Like during Advent, early Advent. Yeah. I mean, I don't know who does it, but I've heard those people do that. And although I think it's completely offensive to all things holy and godly,
yeah.
I have patience with people that do things like that.
And I appreciate that, because when you've been doing it for 128 years, that's just one sacred cow you're not going to touch. And so...
there's no sacred cow I can't make a Big Mac out of, baby.
So, but this ultimately is, we need our hearts strengthened, and indeed the coming of the Lord is near. And that is the job of the preacher, is to assure them that in the midst of our grumbling, we have one who's standing at the door, and we're called to remember the message of the prophets, and that is that you will be saved.
Amen to that, brother. And, this notion of patience, I think for those of you who are preaching in context, and I think more and more all of North America to some degree becomes, there's at least pockets of this context, but I'm sure, Jake, is someone like in Manhattan or here I'm in Metro Philadelphia. Things like atheism and real honest-to-goodness skepticism are so prevalent. And I want to recommend an author named Thomas Halleck, who was actually a guy that is a Czech guy who was a psychotherapist who trained as a Catholic priest behind the Iron Curtain under communism and now still is in Czechoslovakia. And he has two books, one called Night of the Confessor, and the other is called Patience with God. And in Patience with God, he talks about the fact that atheists are not wrong, but it's more an issue of impatience. They want to resolve doubt instead of enduring it. And Halleck actually thinks we can learn something from their insistence that the natural world doesn't point to God or to any necessary meaning, that there's something correct in that. Nature is red in tooth and claw. Their experience of God's absence, he thinks, is a truthful experience that believers often also share. And faith is not a denial of all this, he asserts, but it's an impatient endurance of the ambiguity of the world and the experience of divine absence. And in the epigraph to the book, which is quote by Adele Bestavros, who I don't know who that is, but Bestavros says, patience with others is love. Patience with self is hope, and patience with God is faith. And in a review of this book on Ben Meyer's Faith and Theology blog, I think he's an Australian, he says, in contrast, one of the things he likes about the book is, in contrast to the overblown rhetoric of so many Christian apologists, with their drastic naivete about the ambivalence of the natural world and the intractable difficulties of believing, Halleck's account strikes me as a sensitive and realistic articulation of the difference faith makes. The best thing about his book, again, in contrast to the usual apologetics, is that it's actually a Christian response to atheism. Surely anything a Christian says to an atheist ought to arise not from an invincible commitment to being right, but from an understanding of the kindness of God, an awareness that there is room in God's family even for those who doubt, those for whom the word God cannot easily be deciphered from the dark hieroglyphics of the world.
That is incredible, and that is an awesome illustration. And I think it really ties into James right here in his last statement as an example of suffering and patience. Beloved, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. The truth is that both Christians and atheists suffer. And I think sometimes kind of blind apologetics or arrogant apologetics is a way of Christians deflecting from their suffering as well. And I think that there's a lot of commonality. And there is a word in apologetics in the midst of suffering that Christians can deliver to their fellow human about hope and about a real, and looking at the prophets, and that suffering is a common thing. That book by Shusaku Endo that you did the Mockingbird podcast on the other day, silence. Sometimes there is no word, and so we have to look back to where God has already spoken.
And certainly John the Baptist is one who, in Matthew 11, is experiencing, it seems like, silence. I mean, he's hearing reports of Jesus, and yet it seems that he's in prison still. The pagans still rule Israel through the Herodian client despot. And it's interesting, Jesus' words back to him, they are allusions to, direct quotations from Isaiah 35.
That's right, yeah.
But the thing that he doesn't quote, he leaves out the stuff about your God coming with vengeance, with recompense of God. He will come and save you. So I wonder if John is looking not just for the things Jesus is talking about, the blind receiving their sight, the lame walking, but I wonder if he's wondering, okay, when is the recompense? When will things be put to right? Maybe the tough thing is that Jesus, it seems, doesn't come to bring the judgment, but to bear the judgment.
Yeah. That's very much the truth, I think. And we see that here. I think this is another very powerful Advent illustration. John the Baptist, he spent all of this time preaching and preparing the way, And but what happens when the way doesn't work out the way you thought it should be? What if the way is different than what you were expecting? And so many people in life have thought, if my life should have worked out this way, God, where were you? Why didn't my life work out that way? I was faithful, God. I thought I was doing your will, and my life didn't come this way. And and it's into that real questions bubble up. And are you the one, or should we expect another? What real Christian has never asked that question?
Max Lucado.
Absolutely, yeah. Joel Osteen. That's
Osteen,
right.
yeah.
Good. Creflo Dollar too. But that is a real, and I think this is, where the rubber hits the road. I think on one level with people in their congregation is that there are a lot of folks that are like, man, I thought my life was going to be something else. And I invested, and this is one of the problems I think with kind of free will Christianity, if you will, and a Christianity that puts a lot of emphasis on what you do as opposed to what's already been done for you, is that ultimately it totally puts God in your debt. And so it's into this that Jesus says, go back and tell John what you have witnessed.
Yeah, and I think that, what's interesting is I think the Greek there is scandalazo, right? Blessed is the one who's not scandalized by me. But it's not saying that when you hear the message of the free grace of Jesus, the friend of sinners, that, that's great. I think what it means is everyone will be scandalized in some way, because it's saying that you're not in control of your life, that your norms for reality are not the same as God's. And I heard Tim Keller say something great in a sermon once. He said, every culture has problems with Jesus. The issue is thinking that your culture's problems with Jesus are Jesus' real problems. So everybody says, in New York, everybody loves the John 8 Jesus, woman caught in adultery, non-judgmental Jesus. Judge us not even, I don't condemn you. But the John 14 Jesus, I'm the way, the truth. Whoa! He says, but, in places like Africa, traditional cultures, they would have no problem with the absolute truth Jesus. But how could a Jesus be so soft on adultery in cultures that are traditional and much more family-oriented than we are? So there'll always be something that's a rub. But I think that the grace comes in, not in the initial non-offense, but in the grace of having your offenses annihilated.
Oh, that is great. I once heard a story about a young pastor who had gone to North Dakota to pastor a congregation of Norwegian pietists, and he had gotten out of seminary, and he was a little bit radical, and so on the first Sunday he served wine during Holy Communion, and the entire pietistic congregation went in uproar. Even the pietists who only went to church on Christmas and Easter showed up to the next all-parish meeting. And the young pastor prepared to make his case that Jesus drank wine, and so therefore they should have wine at Holy Communion. And he did the Greek, and he said the Greek word is oinos, and that means wine. And Jesus drank wine, and so shall we. And this little German lady in the back raised her hand, and the pastor called on her and said, yes. And she goes, Jesus drank wine? Ja, und that is one of the things we don't like about Jesus.
I know nothing. I see nothing.
So, but this kind of brings us to the end of Advent 3. So maybe we should go get some coffee or something.
Yeah, it's interesting. I interviewed Makoto Fujimura last week, and in his book about Endo's novel Silence, which the film is coming out, Phil Yancey wrote the foreword. As I'm just thinking about John the Baptist, and it's easy to judge John the Baptist. Here he's sort of questioning, are you really the one I said you were? Yancey at the end of the foreword says this: the entire Bible can be seen, in fact, as a story of betrayal, beginning with Adam and proceeding through the history of the Israelites, culminating in the cross. In an astonishing reversal, the Romans' cruelest execution device became the ubiquitous Christian symbol. At the cross, hiddenness, ambiguity, and strange beauty converge. Every one of Jesus' followers, from the first disciple down through history to the present day, knows the feeling of betrayal, sharp-edged gossip, the stab of envy, that colleague we humiliated, the racist comment that drew a laugh, a sudden and inexplicable cruelty, apologies to our children deserved but never made, a furtive fantasy, a stolen kiss, callousness toward another's misery, an addiction to it demeans or even destroys. In ways small and large, we too step on the fumier. Our only hope is the forgiving gaze of the betrayed Savior, the still point of Endo's novel. It's the forgiving gaze of the betrayed Savior is the only hope for John the Baptist, for Israel, for us, and for the world.
And our ultimate source of all joy.
Thanks for listening to Same Old Song, the lectionary podcast of Mockingbird Ministries. To find out more about Mockingbird, head on over to our website, mbird.com. And if you've got thoughts or feedback, insights you'd like to share, this is a new endeavor, so we'd love to hear them. You send me an email at scottjones@mbird.com. Thanks again for listening, and have a great week.